Thanks, Kathy. And thanks for having me. Remind me at some point to talk a little bit more about preemption if I don't get into it. And also, Kathy, I'd ask if I really like to be interrupted by questions. So if someone has like a pressing question, I can even read it. I can repeat it into the microphone.
Yes.
But I'll certainly take questions at the end. I'm used to speaking to kind of rowdy crowds that will like stop me in my tracks, and I don't mind it at all. So I kind of wanted to introduce myself, and I wanted to introduce the Waterkeepers and Suncoast Waterkeeper and explain how.
Sure, you're close to the microphone. Tom, are you hearing him okay in the speakers? Okay.
How we relate to neighborhood associations, and particularly in Sarasota County. I live in the city, maybe 4 blocks from here. I'm an environmental lawyer. I came to Sarasota, originally my grandparents retired to Anna Maria back in the 70s, and I ended up going to New College and then went to law school at Tulane and moved back to Florida, where I actually worked with, you mentioned Ralph Brooks, who is a local attorney. Ralph and I worked in the Keys together doing environmental law quite some time ago. He's a great resource that we're lucky to have had moved back to Sarasota recently, and has represented also Suncoast Waterkeeper. So I had lived, after New College, I moved to New York and New Orleans and traveled around a lot, but Sarasota had been kind of home more than anywhere else, and maybe 10, 12 years ago I moved back here permanently. And one of the things that I wanted to do in moving back here was to start a local Waterkeeper program. Prior to moving here, I'd lived in New York City on a couple of occasions. I had the honor to work for the original Waterkeeper program, the Hudson Riverkeeper, where I was an attorney working with Bobby Kennedy Jr. That was kind of to set the model of Waterkeepers that has been adopted and embraced around the world. And now there are about 350 Waterkeeper programs or organizations around the world. And and that was an important period in my formation as a young lawyer working for the Hudson Riverkeeper, doing a lot of environmental enforcement and advocacy. Ended up later on in my career moving back to New York, where I was able to work for Waterkeeper Alliance, which is kind of the umbrella organization that helps support and promote Waterkeeper organizations around the world. So each Waterkeeper is its own separate 501c3 small or some large organization. But we're all kind of related in this brotherhood or sisterhood of Waterkeeper organizations. There are now 14 Waterkeepers in the state of Florida. I founded the Suncoast Waterkeeper back in 2012, I believe. Since then, I think we've had the growth of maybe 5 of the Waterkeepers in Florida. Our neighboring Waterkeepers, to the north, there's the Tampa Bay Waterkeeper, which is based in St. Petersburg, which just started about a year ago. And then also within the last year or so to the south, we have the Calusa Waterkeeper program, which protects the Caloosahatchee, Charlotte Harbor area. And within the last 4 months, we actually established a Florida Waterkeepers organization, which I'm on the board of, to help these Waterkeepers that are neighbors and are dealing with a lot of similar situations like red tide that I'm going to focus on, to work collaboratively, to share resources, and to amplify our voice in Tallahassee or on regional issues. So Suncoast Waterkeeper is based here in Sarasota, where I live. We, over the last 8 years or so, have been more active in Manatee County and actually in Pinellas County than we have in Sarasota. But I think that we'll become more active in Sarasota in the months to come, and that also is going to relate to red tide. But our efforts in Manatee County have been focused on fighting back waterfront development, 2 significant developments, one very large one that many of you probably heard about on Longbar Point on northern Sarasota Bay, which is a Carlos Baruf proposed development. We have been involved in fighting that for at least the last 5 years in litigation in many different venues, and are still engaged in trying to protect Longbar Point, which is the last really significant chunk of undisturbed waterfront in in the northern portion, in Sarasota Bay, I believe, certainly the northern portion. But not just that piece of land. The fights that we get engaged in and have been engaged in are more fundamental in defending environmental aspects of our comprehensive plans, or efforts to regulate or enforce the environment. And so we've chosen our fights wisely, because there are a lot of development fights, and I know you guys are engaged in a lot of them. These fights that we have had in Manatee County, we're really pushing back on efforts we thought that were calculated to weaken environmental provisions and comprehensive plans and in state regulation. Our success has been somewhat mixed. I mean, we're tiny and we're up against these very well-financed developers, but we feel that we've had a significant impact. So Suncoast Waterkeeper is it's very small. We're staff. We're volunteers. I'm not paid. We rely on a core of active board members and volunteers, and a large membership in Sarasota, Manatee County, and somewhat Pinellas County. We have a membership of, I'd say, close to 2,000 with a lot more supporters. So it's a grassroots organization like most of the waterkeepers. So I want to give kind of a shout out for waterkeepers in general, and you folks, some of you might live here part-time, you might have a waterkeeper program where you live the other part of the time. So I encourage you to look into your local waterways and see who your watchdogs and advocates are. And so that's kind of a bit of how Suncoast Waterkeeper fits into the neighborhood association. But I also wanted to, structurally, there are other environmental organizations that do good work here in Sarasota County, and there's also the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program. And Jack Merriam and Allison Albee are here tonight. They both sit on the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program Citizen Advisory Committee, which I'm also a member of. And then there are other organizations that you all are probably members of some of them, the Sierra Club, Minnesota 88, and emerging organizations as well that have a lot of energy. And one of the good things about working in this region in Sarasota Manatee is that I see the environmental organizations really collaborate well. I've worked with communities around the country where there's a lot of infighting and fighting for resources, and the environmental groups don't work well together. So when you're facing a battle in your neighborhood, and I think that's one of the great things about Cona, is that you can kind of marshal your forces with other like-minded advocates and communities, and the environmental organizations here, I think. But I wanted to talk, that was kind of a long introduction. I wanted to talk about red tide, and I imagine a lot of you have already heard a lot about red tide. I have. I've been to a lot of talks, I've read a lot. Most of the presentations are based more on science. I'm a lawyer. I think I have a pretty good understanding of it, and I certainly want to share my perspective on, on red tide, how it occurs, why it's here, and we get into some of the science, but I really wanted to talk more about kind of the policy and the things about what we can do. And so that'll kind of be my focus, but and it hits me really close because I'm really fortunate to live on the water in downtown Sarasota. And I was here this summer during the worst of it, and I have a now 10-month-old little boy. And so this was back in the summer, maybe 5 months ago, this little infant living, the water between here and the parking lot, and really being concerned about his health and reading these things like a lot of you on Facebook and the news, and not really understanding very well what the dangers and the risks are. So my summer wasn't like the summer that I'd hoped for, of like these great times going out on the water. I have a boat, we go out all the time, and no fun beach days. It was really more dealing with the stench of rotting fish and marine mammals and carcasses, and that stench that still kind of, for me, really, it still lingers because it came really close to home. So this red tide, and I'm sure a lot of you have lived through other red tides as I have in this area, but this was particularly intense and lasted a particularly long time. It started in November of 2017, and I think we can say that it's pretty much abated. I went online today and looked at the my FWC, which has a great resource, and Moat also does, and saw that the monitoring shows just background levels, or very, very low levels of K. brevis, which is the organism that we all don't like anymore. When my wife was pregnant during the red tide, I kept on joking with her that I wanted to name him Algernon, or algae bloom. And she was having none of that. I'm really glad she didn't let me do that, because I have a feeling that this red tide, although it may have abated, I think it's going to be coming back fiercely in years to come. And I think if algae bloom would get beat up on the playground. So, and I'm kind of curious about, well, I'm not curious, I can assume that red tide has affected all of us in this room, even folks that maybe are coming down for season, at least have neighbors and friends that have been impacted by it one way or the other. We were at Allison and Jack and I were at a meeting last Monday, where we kind of talked about how red tide has impacted the community, and everybody in the room had been affected one way, either economically or concerns for their health or friends or family. And so I imagine the same here. I don't know, has anybody not somehow been affected by red tide in this community? I can't imagine that you haven't. And this community, I think, in many ways was the epicenter of this particular red tide episode. When I look on the map, I see that Sarasota really was kind of ground zero in a lot of ways. And then also to the south, Charlotte Harbor and the Calusa. And one thing I want to kind of distinguish, maybe at the outset I wasn't planning on, but, and this is where I kind of figured someone maybe interrupt me when I get into the science, is that red tide and blue-green algae are two different things that may be related, but I want to kind of differentiate, and I'm going to be talking more about the red tide, which impacted us here and continues to. The blue-green algae is a phenomenon that is more driven by Lake Okeechobee, and the impacts of that were felt very intensely in the Charlotte Harbor at the outfall of the Caloosahatchee River. So they're both harmful algae blooms, but they're different organisms and have different drivers and feeders and impacts. They're related, and I'll kind of get into that. But I want to focus on red tide a bit. So because this is local, this is Sarasota, and we were hit by red tide, and we were hit hard, and so I'll kind of brush over some of the numbers, red tide by the numbers. I'm not going to go into much, but you know, Sarasota County recorded that they removed 255 tons of debris, mainly dead fish, and probably seaweed. We read in the paper the death of over 100 manatees, hundreds of turtles, many dolphin, the whale shark that was found, I think, down in Marco, and the tons and tons of fish that went belly up, and many of which were recovered, many more which sank to the bottom and created more food for red tide to feed on. The ecological impacts were significant, but these things take a long time to really study, so it's hard to say how it's really impacted our bay for the long term. I was at a meeting last week as well where one of the PhDs in the area did talk about some studies that they've been looking at fish counts to see which species were impacted the most, and he was kind of pleased in some way that the impacts weren't as much as he had feared. On the higher end, or that the bigger fish were able to, let's say, escape. The smaller fish and the bait fish were, I think, the majority of the mortalities were in the smaller critters that couldn't get away, or that had the local habitat throughout their life cycle. So I also think back to like the BP spill, where the ecological assessment of that is still ongoing. The official report from the federal government, I think, only came out in 2016, 6 years after the spill. So these things take a long time to really figure out how they impact the ecological communities. And it's also going to take us a while to figure out economically how it's affected us. But we know that there were impacts on our local economy. And there have been estimates that I've seen in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And you think about it. I mean, think about our local fishing communities in Cortez. You think about certainly the tourism industry. And we've seen these numbers. And I think that now the numbers are being accumulated. There was recently a study or an assessment of studies by the Tampa Regional Planning Council that threw out an estimate of, I think it was $190 million. We're starting to see some analysis of the impacts. The health impacts, again, Mode is actually doing, I think, a study on the health impacts, but we've seen and heard, I certainly know people that have had health impacts. A dear friend of mine was pregnant living on siesta, had a terrible reaction, having respiratory difficulties and had to move. There were increased hospitalizations and reports of numerous animal deaths. So we know it's bad, but what is it? And I'll touch pretty briefly on it because I imagine you're a pretty well-educated group that you know, I mean, the basics, but it's K. brevis, named after a local researcher, Cona brevis. It is a toxic dinoflagellate organism. And this is where I want to focus a lot of my attention on, the term naturally occurring, because I think over the course of the last couple of years, we've seen an explanation of what red tide is kind of mature. And it was very frustrating, maybe in year one, that every time I heard or read about it, it was naturally occurring, and then it was kind of left at that. And that was incredibly frustrating. I think now everybody recognizes that it's naturally occurring, but that it is fueled by human activity. And the fuel and the human activity is kind of more the focus of my talk. But I think that for a long time, and whether it was agencies or thought leaders or individuals, people were continuing this mantra of naturally occurring. And I think that it was calculated to absolve governments, regulators, and I think it was really bandied about irresponsibly. Even by, sometimes there were retractions amongst the scientific community where even that it was loosely used. So I want to push back on that and certainly see if anybody has questions about it, but it's acknowledged that red tide is a naturally occurring phenomenon. It's this small organism that is found offshore, 30, 40 miles. It feeds on nitrogen that is fixed. Getting a little complicated, but this is a global phenomenon. The nitrogen is fixed by Saharan dusts and other sources of iron that make it available for K. brevis to consume. And then it basically becomes toxic. So it naturally occurs through these phenomena offshore, and it can come onshore through a number of different ways. It can get pushed onshore by wind, by currents, but importantly, it can get fed by nitrogen and phosphorus inputs coming from onshore that we create. Or once it gets pushed here, it can get fed by all the inputs that we make, that we add to our waterways, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. Here, I think the story is more about nitrogen. So what does it do? I mean, it's toxic. It will kill fish. It can be toxic to humans if you eat shellfish that have the toxin in them. And then the fish will die, and then they start decomposing, and then they create more nitrogen that then further feed the red tide. And so I think the food that we provide this red tide is this nitrogen comes from our human activities. that we contributed through significant changes in land use over decades and in increase in human activity. And so how do we contribute this fuel that feeds the red tide? Thanks. I'm going to save that until later. Well, actually, I'll talk a little bit. I mean, so this is a question about the seagrasses. I think that the seagrasses, and if anybody knows the answer, survived this pretty well. There was a massive die-off of fish communities, and I think some impacts on seagrasses. But the seagrass, stability of the seagrasses, I think, pretty much survived. And so we still have this continuing success story, and this is a good kind of counterpoint of seagrasses, which are really important. They're kind of the indicator of health of the bay in many ways. They are habitat for small baby fish, as well as mangroves. And we've seen a comeback in the seagrass populations in Sarasota and Tampa Bays since a crash in the 60s and 70s. And so you've got this very healthy seagrass complex ecosystem. And you look outside today, it's beautiful, and the water's so clear. But it can fool you because the health of our bays is and our local waterways, they're really imperiled. And we've seen over the last several years a constant increase in nitrogen levels, which is a bad indicator and an indicator that the health of our waterways is declining. And we know that nitrogen is the fuel that is going to likely cause future incidents of red tide. So, while we have healthy seagrasses, we're seeing an increase in nitrogen, which I think is similar to what the trends were over in the other coast in the Indian River Lagoon before the crash there. So I'm really worried about a crash of our wonderful ecosystem. But I was kind of talking about how this nitrogen has come to flow into our bay. And it's through a million ways. And so there are also a million ways to try to make it better. But some of the big ways are just historic trends in all the people that moved here and the change in land use, the development, the farming. The farming uses fertilizers. Those fertilizers end up going into waterways. Development uses fertilizer, and more importantly here, I think, the massive amount of development that we've seen over the last 50 or so years has re-engineered our stormwater system from a natural system where rainy season, we have a big rains, and they historically would stay in marshes and wetlands. They would cover lowlands, and they would gradually make their way into the bays. And in the process, a lot of that water would percolate back into the aquifer and or evaporate. The way that we've re-engineered our communities here are to get rid of stormwater. Otherwise it goes into your garage or a big puddle that you can't get through to get to your mailbox. Nobody wants it, nobody complains about it. So we've engineered it so that it gets off of our land as soon as possible and goes into the bay to flush it out. In the process, it picks up all sorts of pollutants and nitrogen. Everything from dog poop and squirrel poop to fertilizers that you put on your gardens, many sources of nitrogen. Natural as well, decaying matter. But the influx of nitrogen and pollution that we have created and then engineered to flush into our bays, I think, is a big part of the story here that hasn't been described very well in a lot of talks that I've gone to and things that I've read. And I think the other part of that is kind of the engineering, is the sewage systems that I want to talk So fertilizer inputs, I want to get back to, but sewage is a big piece here, and sewage is something that I've become expert at. My wife isn't so proud of me in saying that I'm like a sewage expert, but so I recently have come up on the tail end of 2 successful lawsuits. One is still wrapping up in Pinellas County, where we, and I think it was in the media over the last couple of years, massive sewage spills by the city of St. Petersburg, and also the smaller satellite cities in Pinellas County that send their sewage down into St. Pete. And we were seeing millions and millions of gallons of sewage spilled directly into local waterways during tropical storms over the last several years. Why? Because in St. Petersburg, as well as here in Sarasota City and Sarasota County and throughout much of Florida, we have this decaying infrastructure. Sewage systems that were designed and built many decades ago and have incredibly expensive and demanding needs in keeping them maintained and in planning for future growth to accommodate additional development. So I have seen throughout the state of Florida, and this is a national phenomenon as well, the decay of these sewage systems and the failure of municipalities to meet the needs of their communities in maintaining an adequate sewage system. The result is raw sewage in the streets in many cases. And a failure at the state level to adequately enforce permits and the federal level, which are set in place to make sure that these sewage systems operate in a manner which does not allow sewage to spill out into local waterways. It's kind of the foundation of the Clean Water Act. We're trying to protect communities and make sure that the mandate of fishable, swimmable waters is complied with. So we saw a terrible failure, particularly in the case of St. Petersburg, at the time when there was no Tampa Bay Waterkeeper yet. So it kind of fell on us to take action because even those waters in St. Pete mix with our Tampa Bay waters. So we filed a Clean Water Act lawsuit, which we fought for the last 2 years and successfully were able to negotiate a settlement which beefed up significantly the state enforcement, but also went beyond that. We hired engineers to basically help them, at the end of the day, to figure out how to fix their systems, to help over a course of many years, several years, they're going to be identifying the faults, remedying them, and having a mechanism in place to pay for them under, importantly, federal oversight. So coming off that success in St. Pete, I've been looking locally and looking at a lot of failures in Sarasota County, Manatee County of our sewage systems. And you see it in the newspaper. Recently there was a really significant spill right there in the city of Sarasota that was almost 1 million gallons of sewage. If I look at Sarasota County, it's a lot worse. I haven't seen like the big spills, which is unfortunate, I think, in the city of Sarasota. It was a pipe that had a life expectancy of like 90 years, and it decayed and failed after something like 640. I mean, these things happen. Sewage spills happen. It's hard to maintain infrastructure. But I am seeing systemic problems in Sarasota. The city has acknowledged that they need to spend more money on their sewage systems, and in Sarasota County, there are significant systemic problems with their sewage collection system. And another big problem in Sarasota County is beyond their collection system, which is, I can say, leaky. The problem is when it rains a lot, the rain has to go